in art history. Award-winning graphic designer, she has held the Robert S. and Grace B. Kerr Fellowship in the School of Art. Hadley has delivered papers at numerous conferences, including the Native American Art Studies Association. Her essay on the Kiowa photographer Horace Pulaw was published in the Great Plains Quarterly. Presentation this afternoon, which is based on her essay in the catalog of the current exhibition, is titled Picturing Home, Allan Houser's Children's Book Illustrations, 1952 to 19. Essay, which I might add, emerged out of a course that I taught, so I'm proud of this one. So please welcome Hadley Jerman.
Nice words. Yeah. Thank you to the museum for having me and inviting. The comment on Houser's book illustrations, it was also wonderful to get to talk to. And thank you so much to David Rettig, who shared his time and expertise last summer with me and went through a lot of these book illustrations in person, which that was just a really invaluable experience. Between 1952 and 1962, world-renowned Chiricahua Apache artist Allan Houser illustrated 7 children's books. Published during the 11 years Houser spent teaching at Intermountain Indian School in Brigham City, Utah, the books range from picture-driven stories for young readers to intermittently illustrated novels and biographies for adolescents. All feature narratives centered on Native American protagonists, were published by mainstream East Coast publishing houses, and occupy a decade in Houser's art production, bound on one end by 2-dimensional murals and paintings, and on the other by 3-dimensional sculpture. Houser's illustrations, especially those published in Edgar Wyatt's Geronimo, the Last Apache War Chief in 1952, and Cochise, Apache Warrior and Statesman, 1953, reflect the artist's own family and tribal history, and stories he heard from his father, Sam Houses, while growing up in southwestern Oklahoma. Jackson Rushing describes Houser's oeuvre as, quote, a body of work predicated on the idea of telling true stories. In the case of his book illustrations, the true stories involved Mangus Coloradus, Houser's great-grandfather, and Geronimo, the artist's distant relative. Houser recalled, quote, my dad used to tell stories nightly and sing songs. I remember this, and a lot of this comes out in my sculpture and painting. The illustrations also reveal, as Rushing has made clear, Houser's abiding interest in American Western art. When Houser arrived at the studio at the Santa Fe Indian School in 1934, he expressed an interest in creating realistic, action-driven works in the vein of popular American Western artists Charles M. Russell and Frederick Remington. However, Dorothy Dunn, the studio's instructor, deemed such material inappropriate for her native students. Later criticized Houser in 1968 for his, quote, illustrative images in the manner of celebrated earlier painters of the Old West, end quote. Dunn's comment may as well have been directed at Houser's pen vignettes published a decade earlier in Edgar Wyatt's Geronimo and Cochise. The drawings burst with Russell-esque energy. Horses gallop and buildings burn amid neatly rendered southwestern landscapes. And I should note that some of these images are scans from the books, and you can tell because the caption is right there on the page. And then the others are actual images of the original drawings where we still have them, where they're extant. Okay. Stylistically, Houser's book illustrations of the 1950s and early 60s reflect the artist's growing interest in sculpture through increasingly modeled forms. Illustrations published in Geronimo and Cochise, and for Salish Kootenai author Darcy McNichol's Renner in the Sun in 1954, consist of simple line drawings of, at times, cartoonish figures and landscape. Houser's drawings for Cochise contain more accomplished figure renditions than those published in Geronimo a year earlier, perhaps due in part to the larger amounts of space afforded them. Houser's extant original ink drawings for Cochise also reveal McGraw-Hill's heavy edits when compared to the illustrations in the book. Not only were his double-page line drawings divided in two with wide margins between them, thus not true double trucks, but in some cases only half of the original drawing was used. Most interestingly, or politically, McGraw-Hill excised several of Houser's images depicting Apache warriors engaged in violence. The publisher chose not to include Battle Scene, which features Apache warriors firing on soldiers and vice versa, or Apache warriors dragging off body, an illustration of warriors dragging a soldier by the neck as they gallop away from a fort. Now, Houser's line drawings for Don Wilcox's Joe Sunpool, published by Little Brown and Company in 1956, contain even more volumetric forms and accomplished figure drawing. His fame as a burgeoning sculptor even figured into the novel's plot. In one illustration, Houser depicts the titular Navajo character and his friends viewing Houser's own monumental stone sculpture, Comrade in Mourning, at Haskell Institute in Lawrence, Kansas. The image in the bottom on the center, and we've already seen images of Comrade in Mourning today, so that should look familiar. Okay. Houser's first picture book commission of the decade came in 1954 with Anne Nolan Clark's Blue Canyon Horse. In Blue Canyon Horse, Houser's double-page tempera paintings alternate with black India ink drawings printed in sepia. He achieves perspective and the illusion of space through the juxtaposition of thin color washes that suggest distant canyon walls against opaque blocks of orange tempera foreground. Houser also submitted a design for the end pages and signed and dated a painting which he intended for. Unfortunately, his cover painting was never published, replaced with a painting used inside the book. So this is the image that replaced the cover painting. The change reminds us that while Houser's input was valued, even his illustrations were subject. Houser's investment in the illustration process for Blue Canyon Horse is evidenced by his numerous pentimenti, and the large scale and detail of his original illustrations. Houser's original paintings reproduced double-page spreads in the book often span 28 by 18 inches. And his ink drawings reproduced on single pages fill 12 by 18-inch sheets. Here, pencil marks indicate crop marks and text boxes. Scrawled page numbers note the illustration's placement in the book, and damage from tape residue hints at the paste-up process. And this is something you can really notice when you look at the illustrations up close in the gallery. You'll notice the publisher's marks right on the page. The tape and publisher's marks remind us that these finely rendered paintings and drawings served for Viking Press as a means to an end. In 1958, Houser was commissioned to create the 59th medal for the American Society of Medalists. His black and white ink drawings for Elizabeth Coatsworth's The Cave, published by Viking the same year, relate stylistically to his designs cast on opposite sides of the medal. In both reliefs for the medal and drawings for the cave, Houser used texture and shadow rather than outlines to define modeled forms, and he juxtaposed reversed out figures against darker backgrounds. Thus, the illustrations possess a sculptured, etching-like appearance. Drawings of Jim, the Navajo protagonist, and of sheep prefigure not only the subject matter, but also the modeled surfaces and curvaceous lines that would appear in Houser's sculpture in following decades. Extant correspondence from Viking and Houser's notes in the margins of his drawings reveal his active input into the cave's production. In a letter accompanying galleys for the book, Viking's May Massey wrote, quote, "We hope you'll illustrate the cave and mark the places where you'd like to make drawings, and whether you want the drawings to fill the page or the half page," end quote. Thus, Houser chose which aspects of the story he wanted to illustrate and which scenes he wanted to emphasize through scale. He also designed the jacket image and end pages, chose the binding cover, and he created an illustration to be embossed on the front cover. Houser's significant input into the cave's production is perhaps most evidenced by the fact that he, rather than a production artist, painted the three-color separations on celluloid that together form the vibrant melon, orange, and purple cover image of Jim, Lamb, and Jim, Lamb, and Cave printed on the book jacket. So here on the left you have the actual cover painting of Houser's notes on the bottom, and then on the right this is the kind of separation. Then on the left the purple, and on the right the orange. Houser created etching-like ink drawings and bold color paintings for his most heavily illustrated children's book commission, Anne Nolan's Clark, The Desert People, published by Viking in 1962. Houser's paint colors, blue, orange, green, mauve, and brown, are finely matched by the 4 overprinted inks that appear in the printed book. Richly hued, ornate paintings depict changing seasons of village life for Tohono O'odham people of southeastern Arizona. Not only are the colors dramatic, but according to Nelson Foss, late curator of the Allan Houser Foundation, they reflect Houser's deliberate move away from, quote, the rather confining style and flat, subdued pastels, end quote, of Dunn's Santa Fe Indian School studio. Perhaps most impressive of all his children's book illustrations in terms of time and energy exerted, and most stylistically distant from the studio. Houser's illustrations for The Desert People would also be his last. In 1962, the same year that Viking published The Desert People, Houser left Utah and book illustration permanently when he was appointed as the first painting and sculpture instructor at Santa Fe's newly minted Institute of American Indian Art. Now, that Houser's mid-century book illustrations increasingly come as no surprise. In a later interview, he acknowledged that as early as the late 1930s, while studying at the Santa Fe Indian School, he wanted to break free from two-dimensional Indian art and to create three-dimensional. Houser took issue with Dorothy Dunn's limiting view of what constituted Native art. Quote, call it the Santa Fe Indian School flat, he said. When you weren't doing that, it wasn't Indian art. That bothered me. And his dismay upon learning that he would not be taught life drawing or anatomy, or be encouraged to paint in a realistic manner, seemed in part due to his association of the Western artist illustrators he Thus, Houser's book illustrations not only provided a means for him to step away from the studio style, color, modeling, and perspective, but also served as a canvas for him to explore the truth-telling realism and action-oriented subject matter he admired in American Western. However, I would argue that when viewed as a whole, it is not these galloping horses or famed Apache leaders or even dramatic narrative that dominate Houser's children's book illustrations. In direct opposition to the backgroundless and flat Santa Fe Indian School style, Houser's characters travel through complex environments populated by a host of rocks and plants. In fact, I would argue Houser's book illustrations at mid-century often seem to be exuberantly about landscape. Furthermore, in Geronimo, Cochise, Blue Canyon Horse, The Cave, and The Desert People in particular, Houser's drawings and paintings, realistic, memorable landscapes, do not merely literally illustrate the text they accompany, but visually reinforce concepts of memory, home, and identity, ultimately creating more complicated narratives than what is literally present in the text. Now, in Geronimo, and I should say, you notice on the title page it says illustrated by Allan Houser, direct descendant of Geronimo, but Houser was actually a distant relative, not a direct descendant. In Geronimo, Houser established a canon of landscape elements that would appear throughout his subsequent book illustrations and subsequent drawings and paintings. Here, twisting juniper trees, fan-like sprays of desert grasses, shafts of yucca, and sandstone rock formations that seem to melt into the landscape make their first appearance. Perhaps Houser repeated these same forms again and again because it was time effective to do so. However, he was under no obligation to render such complicated scenery in illustrations like "A knife flashed and another miner vanished," one of the few Houser illustrations that McGraw-Hill published of Apaches directly engaged in violence. Wyatt's narrative simply states, quote, "If one miner wandered into the hills, a brown body dived from a high boulder and crashed upon his back. An Apache knife flashed and another miner vanished," end quote. Houser includes the elements Wyatt describes, but also inserted a rifle grasped club-like in the miner's hands, suggesting the miner is not an innocent or helpless victim of Apache aggression. More pertinent to our discussion of landscape is that Houser refrained from downplaying environment for the sake of action. Rather, the landscape visually reinforces the danger at hand. The spiny plant beneath the miner echoes the form of the Apache's knife. Two yucca leaning at odd angles in the middle left distance assume the appearance of shocked or anxious bystanders. And the anthropomorphic form of a hoodoo towers above the conflict, serving as silent witness to violence in the desert. Houser also anthropomorphized hoodoos throughout the Cochise illustrations he made the following year. In Warriors Carrying Fallen Comrade, hoodoos mimic the forms of the exhausted and grieving Apache band that travels through them. The drawing depicts Chiricahuas transporting a deceased Cochise to his burial site. By visually locating the hoodoos among the funeral procession, Houser suggests that the rocks and the hills mourn. Not only did Houser fill his illustrations with empathetic rock formations and vegetation, but he rendered specific plants. This attention to accurate representation evokes Western art's preoccupation with accuracy, while serving the practical function of educating mainstream American audiences about the desert Southwest. In fact, in illustrations for Cochise, Houser often rendered landscapes with as much, if not more, detail as the figures that race through them. An illustration of a stagecoach hurrying across the desert contains no less than 9 identifiable desert plants. Count them if you like. In contrast to Houser's visual catalog of desert succulents, Wyatt's text focuses instead on the potential threat of Apache attack. Quote, "Butterfield drivers crossed this stretch of desert with all the speed they could. There was danger here from the roving bands of many Apache tribes," end quote. Ironically, and I would argue intentionally, Houser includes no suggestion of Apaches or danger in the scene, save for a man perched atop the stagecoach riding shotgun. Instead, Houser again anthropomorphizes the desert. The two yucca in the foreground huddle together, and Houser makes us feel as if we are behind them, peering over their shoulders as they observe the stage. Contrast, a distant saguaro on the right edge of the composition definitely faces toward the viewer, and with one arm lifted across its body. The viewer cannot help but read this gesture as one of hand to lips, as if this succulent is surprised or aghast at the intruding Butterfield stage and its armed guardian. 8 other distant saguaros pose with hands up, imbuing Houser's landscape with humor as well as irony. While the image lacks the suggestion of danger due to many roving bands of Apaches, its cast of succulents appears deeply concerned of the stagecoach, its firearm-brandishing driver, and the passengers inside. Houser not only depicted specific types of plants in book illustrations, but he also imbued landscape with a symbolic quality. This is evident in the anthropomorphized cacti in his Cochise illustrations, but more powerfully in his closing illustration for Geronimo, which bears the caption, "Geronimo sat in the sun and dreamed of his great battles." At this point in Wyatt's narrative, the year is 1894, and Geronimo is 66 years old, imprisoned with his people at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. The Apaches would be incarcerated there until 1913 and 14, 5 years after Geronimo's death. In 1914, of course you all have heard this, Allan Houser would be the first Chiricahua Apache child to be born out of captivity. In the illustration, Geronimo sits on a layered sandstone rock, a small juniper bush behind him. To his left, nine spindly ocotillo arms poke out from behind a rock, and the clumps of desert grasses that populate Houser's paintings and illustrations grow in tufts at his feet. One of the sparest illustrations in the book. No clouds scud across the sky. No mountains or hoodoos rise up behind the Apache leader. Plants are small, diminutive, growing. But they are not Oklahoma plants. And Houser, having grown up in arid southwestern Oklahoma, would have known the difference. Houser surrounds the aging Geronimo with the same southern New Mexico and Arizona landscape that surrounds his protagonist throughout the book. No shadowy images of warfare or the great battles mentioned in the text. Rather, the landscape is the sole reference to Geronimo's past. It serves as Geronimo's memory. Quote, he dreamed of his battles, end quote. Thus, Houser suggests that Geronimo's sense of self is not defined by battles won or lost, but by the land itself. Concerning the stories of Geronimo he grew up hearing from his father, Houser said, quote, those memories stayed within my mind through the years, and I began to be very interested in who I was. Houser was who Geronimo was, and who the Apaches were in Houser's depiction is directly tied to the desert. In the words of Houser's son, the federal government, quote, separated us from the most essential thing to being Apache, our land, end quote. This overt connection between landscape and native identity persists throughout Houser's illustrations published in subsequent children's books. In Anne Nolan Clark's Blue Canyon Horse of 1954, Houser created an even more specific home place using the same canon of rocks, trees, and grasses. In this story of a mare who leaves her canyon home for freedom among a Mustang herd, eventually to return with her foal, repeated forms not only indicate the same kind of bush and rock, but the exact same bush and rock. Houser depicts a wizened juniper tree, which you see in the center of this slide, from different angles as the mare climbs, gazes down into, and descends the canyon ledge. This specific tree orients the reader to the landscape and acts as a signpost. When we see the red-barked tree tenaciously clinging to the ridge, we know that the boy and his mare are almost home. Houser's rendering of vegetation on the canyon floor also orients readers to the canyon, gradually inviting them farther into the boy's home. Houser's opening four-color painting depicts the mare reaching for a tuft of grass near a calm stream. Not until 8 spreads later does Houser reveal that the distant row of trees is the boy's home. Beneath them, stalks of corn grow. So if you look, several spreads later, Houser provides a bird's eye view of the canyon floor, a more intimate picture of the boy's home than Clark's text, which says, on the floor of the canyon, the corn is harvested, the cactus fruit is cut, the piñon nuts are gathered, the storerooms of the people are full. After an additional 8 spreads, Houser provides the reader a glimpse inside the boy's house as he sleeps, anticipating his mare's return. Gradual narrowing of focus familiarizes the reader with the boy's home landscape as a real place, a recognizable place. By the time the mare returns with the foal at the story's close, readers understand what the canyon looks and feels like. For readers and for the mare, the familiar vegetation provides a sort of homecoming. In Blue Canyon Horse, Houser depicted not only a realistic place, but a real place. For Houser and those who recognize its steep red walls, narrow spaces, and fertile floor, this is Canyon de Chelly, sacred home to the Navajo or Dene people. Clark never names the canyon in the text, nor does she allude to the Dene's long history there. Unlike the mare's voluntary decision to leave home in Clark's story, the Dene were forced to leave their homes in the canyon in 1864 and to walk 300 miles to captivity at Bosque Redondo before eventually being allowed to return in 1868. The significance of the mare's homecoming and the boy's steadfast waiting for her in a canyon that closely resembles Canyon de Chelly was probably lost on Viking's mainstream audience. But to Houser, and especially to his Navajo students far from home at Intermountain Indian School in Utah, the relationship between place, identity, and home must have been poignantly obvious. In the words of children's book scholar Joseph Schwartz, a child's or people's identity is closely related to, quote, a sense of attachment and belonging, of being rooted in a place. Although non-Navajo readers may miss the significance of Houser's depiction of Canyon de Chelly in Blue Canyon Horse, they could hardly mistake the rock towers looming in the distance of his illustrations for Elizabeth Coatsworth's The Cave. Nearly 20 years earlier, John Ford had directed Stagecoach amid Monument Valley's iconic rock formations, creating a precedent for a host of Western films produced at mid-century in the same landscape on the Arizona-Utah border. The massive Mitten Buttes and Three Sisters loom in the distance of Houser's engraving-like ink drawings, accentuating foreground drama and reflecting the protagonist's psychological state throughout the story. Coatsworth suggests Jim, who is the Navajo protagonist, she suggests Jim finds the valley terrifying because it lacks places to hide. Houser most effectively conveys Jim's anxiety in an image of Jim and Fernando resting at noon. Coatsworth writes, quote, Fernando and Jim found a little shade beside a rock, with the dogs lying near them. Birds were singing their spring songs, and everywhere there were desert flowers, end quote. But Houser's illustration contains no flowers and no singing birds. Instead, simple horizontal lines imply buzzards floating in the distance. Most striking is the looming shape of rock overhanging Jim and Fernando. This rock is not the benign provider of shade in Coatsworth's text. Rather, it overshadows Jim like a dark cloud about to devour him. In fact, Houser's rock visually depicts Jim's mental state described a few sentences later. Quote, the sense of danger hung over him, end quote. Later on, the real source of Jim's fear, a cave where his ancestors were murdered, proves to be a source of safety. Coatsworth likens the cave's entrance to, quote, the doorway of a Navajo hogan, end quote, and Houser makes the opening womb-like. With organic asymmetrical sides narrowing to a point at the top, the entrance in fact closely resembles Houser's abstracted drawings and sculptures of motherly female forms made in following decades. Jim's anxiety leaves him in the cave his ancestors lived and died in. Like the mare in Blue Canyon Horse, he finds safety and peace in the place he initially sought to avoid. Thus Coatsworth, like Clark, not so subtly suggests it is at ancestral homes and not in urban areas where indigenous people find belonging. However, Houser shows readers explicitly where that home is by depicting specific landscapes. Houser's illustrations speak most vibrantly of individuals' relationship to a specific landscape in his final and most heavily illustrated children's book commission, Anne Nolan Clark's The Desert People, published. Here too, Houser depicts real places, most notably the historic Mission San Javier del Bac outside Tucson. The inclusion reflects, as Rushing has pointed out, locals' veneration of the church and the Tohono O'odham's fusion of indigenous beliefs with Roman Catholic religious practice. Although Clark refrains from naming the site in her text, its importance to readers and viewers is evidenced by the fact that this image is Houser's most frequently exhibited children's book illustration. David Reddig, Allan Houser Inc. curator, claims the image's popularity is primarily due to viewers' familiarity with the historic Spanish mission. So why did Houser create such specific real places in his children's book, especially when no named locations existed in it? Given that he filled 239 sketchbooks with drawings, many of them landscape studies, it seems no surprise that landscape forms some of the most sophisticated, character-like elements of his illustrations. And as someone committed to, in Rushing's words, telling true stories, makes sense that Houser situated his characters in real places. Houser's depiction of and emphasis on specific landscapes seems especially pertinent given that he too was far from home during the 11 years he spent illustrating children's books. In retrospect, his careful rendering of Cholla and Yucca in books illustrated during his years in Utah seem almost lovingly done, as if enacted partially out of homesickness. Ultimately, Houser's extant book illustrations bear witness to many voices: Euro-American authors, East Coast publishing houses, editors, and Houser himself. While themes of home, identity, and safety found in the books Houser illustrated amid reflect their authors' responses to federal Indian policies of relocation and termination, Houser confronts the reader again and again with particular rocks, cacti, and land. Whether that land responds to the text in a humorous or ironic way, cacti surprised by stagecoaches, visibly represents Geronimo's remembered past, or depicts actual locations, Houser's book illustrations assert that home and identity are intricately linked not to just any place, but to very specific places, that is, home landscapes. Thus, in picturing home, Houser pictures not only Navajo and Apache identities, but his own.